The rain had not stopped in 5 days. It came in sheets, drumming against the roof of Jed Cartwright's modest ranch house like the hooves of 1,000 wild horses. The clouds hung low and heavy over the valley, casting a pale gray gloom over everything. The river that curled past the far edge of his property, usually calm and shallow, had turned into a roaring, untamed beast. Muddy water surged past the banks, swollen from melted snow in the highlands and the relentless downpour that had pounded the land for days. Fence posts had vanished beneath the waves, and stray branches and debris rushed downstream like desperate refugees fleeing some invisible war. Jed, a solitary cowboy hardened by years of frontier life, had ridden out early that morning to check on his cattle, which grazed near the lowlands. He wore a soaked canvas duster and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the rain, but even those offered little protection. Every hoofstep of his horse sloshed through thick muck, and every gust of wind slapped his face with cold mist. The prairie was no place for the weak, and Jed knew better than most that nature didn't care whether a man was ready or not. As he made his way down toward the river bend, he heard something strange, something that didn't belong to the soundscape of storm and thunder. It was high-pitched and raw, a cry not the yip of a coyote or the bawl of a calf, but something human. Yet's heart jumped. He pulled back on the reins, his eyes scanning the flooded bank. Then he saw her, a young figure, barely more than a shadow, in the torrent, was being tossed about in the river's grip. A girl, small, maybe 12 or 13, her arms flailing weakly, trying to grab onto anything. Her dark hair whipped around her face as she was dragged along by the unforgiving current. Jed didn't pause. He leaped from his saddle before the horse even came to a full stop, throwing off his hat and boots in the mud. Without so much as a thought, he dove headfirst into the freezing water. The cold hit him like a hammer. The river was thick and wild, trying to rip him away from his direction with every movement. He kicked hard, muscles straining as he swam toward her. The girl's head dipped below the surface once, then again. Jed pushed himself harder, teeth clenched, heart pounding, not just from the exertion but from a desperation he hadn't felt in years. She couldn't be more than a few seconds from disappearing for good. Finally, his fingers brushed against fabric, a piece of her drenched dress. He lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him. She didn't resist. She was nearly unconscious. He wrapped an arm around her small body and turned, fighting the current to get them back to shore. It felt like dragging a sack of rocks upstream, every stroke a battle. By the time he reached the shallows, his limbs were burning and his lungs ached. He collapsed onto the muddy bank with her in his arms, water streaming off both of them. She was limp, her eyes closed, her lips blue. For a horrifying moment, he thought he was too late. But then, a shallow breath, a small, choking cough. Jed rolled her gently onto her side, patting her back, urging the river water out of her lungs. When she finally gasped, drawing in a thin wheeze of air, relief flooded him. He scooped her up again and carried her to his cabin. Her body felt like a pile of wet sticks, light but fragile, shivering uncontrollably in his arms. She didn't speak, didn't open her eyes, but she was alive, and that was enough. Inside the cabin, he wrapped her in wool blankets, stoked the fire to full strength, and heated water for tea. As steam filled the small space, Jed sat beside her, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't know who she was or how she ended up in the river, but something told him this girl's presence on his land was no accident, and saving her would bring consequences larger than he could imagine. The girl remained silent through the night. Wrapped in thick wool blankets, she lay beside the crackling hearth, her breathing shallow but steady. Jed Cartwright sat across from her, a tin mug of coffee in his hands, though it had long gone cold. His boots were drying near the fire, and his shirt still clung damply to his back. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, but inside the cabin, the silence had taken on a strange weight, not one of peace, but of mystery. The girl had not spoken a word since he'd pulled her from the river. Jed had cleaned the mud from her hands, face, and hair with a warm cloth. Beneath the grime, he could see she was young, maybe 13 or 14, with high cheekbones and long black hair that glistened now in the firelight. Her dress was simple, torn near the hem, soaked and ragged. Around her neck hung a beaded necklace, tribal in design, and the craftsmanship was fine, not something worn by a common wanderer. Whoever she wasn't lost by accident. At some point, she'd stirred and opened her eyes, deep brown, alert, but guarded. Jed had offered her water. She drank, but still said nothing. When he tried to ask her name, she only blinked, then turned her face toward the fire and closed her eyes again. It was clear she understood him, but something held her tongue. He wasn't the type to pry. Living alone for 8 years on the edge of the prairie taught a man to respect silence. Still, he couldn't help wondering, who was she? Where had she come from? Why had no one come looking for her? Outside, his horse shifted restlessly in the stable, as if sensing something Jed could not. The wind carried strange sounds that night, a distant coyote's cry, an owl's hoot, and once, just before midnight, a faint drumbeat that seemed to echo from the hills to the north. Jed had stood on his porch, rifle in hand, listening, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. leaving only the chirp of crickets behind. He didn't sleep that night. His instincts told him that trouble, or perhaps something greater, was moving closer. The girl wasn't an ordinary runaway or castaway, and the land around his ranch was too wild, too sacred, for coincidences. At dawn, when the rain finally stopped and the first orange sliver of sunlight cut through the low clouds, Jed stepped outside. That's when he saw them. 5 riders stood on the ridge overlooking his ranch, motionless as statues. They were tall, proud men, in tribal dress, feathers in their hair, spears in their hands, faces painted with symbols of honor and war. And behind them, down the hill, were more, dozens more. Mounted warriors lined the slope in complete silence, their horses snorting steam into the morning air. Each wore ceremonial garments, deerskin, beads, woven sashes, and carried gifts wrapped in blankets. It was a procession, a gathering of tribes, 5 different ones, by Yet's count, Apache, Lakota, Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne, all nations, that rarely gathered in peace, let alone under one sunrise. Jed's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like it in his life. He stepped off the porch slowly, raising both hands, not in fear, but in respect. These were not raiders or invaders. Their eyes were calm, not hostile. They had not come to threaten. They had come for something else. Behind him, the door creaked open. The girl, pale, trembling but standing, had stepped out into the dawn light. She looked at the warriors on the ridge and gave a single nod, solemn and full of meaning. One of the riders raised a hand in response. In that moment, Jed understood. She wasn't lost. She was royalty, the daughter of a chief, perhaps, or a future leader. Whatever her role, she had gone into the river as a child on the edge of death, and now 5 tribes stood before Jed Cartwright, not to demand retribution, but to offer something no man on the frontier had ever received: gratitude. Jed Cartwright had seen many strange things in his time: gunfights at high noon, cattle swallowed by flash floods, a preacher who claimed he saw angels in the clouds, but nothing compared to the sight now unfolding in front of his cabin. More than 100 mounted native warriors descending from the ridge in perfect silence, carrying bundles wrapped in colorful blankets, their eyes fixed ahead with calm purpose. He didn't move. He didn't have to. Something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through storms and border skirmishes, told him this was not a moment for words, but for reverence. The girl stood beside him, barefoot on the damp earth, her wet hair still clinging to her back. She hadn't said anything, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders were straighter, her chin higher. This was no longer the lost child who had been dragged from a raging river. This was someone important. At the front of the procession rode 5 men, clearly elders, their long braids streaked with gray, faces weathered by wind and wisdom. Each wore a different style of headdress or symbol across his chest. One had a carved eagle claw necklace, another a buffalo horn sash. Without being told, Jed understood these were leaders of their respective tribes, and somehow, they had all come together. For her, the lead elder dismounted and stepped forward. His eyes met Jed's and held them. No threat, no challenge, only quiet respect. Then he bowed. A bow from a chief. Jed could hardly believe it. The man then turned to the girl. She stepped forward with a grace that was both childlike and ceremonial. She placed her hand on his, and he spoke in a language Jed didn't know, soft and lyrical, the words rolling like wind through grass. She replied, only a few syllables, but with quiet authority. Then the elder looked back at Jed and nodded. Find him. The other riders began dismounting and opening their bundles. They laid out items on the ground before his barn: hand-woven blankets dyed with natural reds and blues, carved tools made of obsidian and bone, bundles of dried meat and fruit, jugs of herbs, and even a gleaming silver pendant shaped like a bear paw. These were not mere trinkets. They were sacred gifts, things not often given outside the tribe, symbols of deep gratitude. One younger warrior stepped forward and offered Jed a beautifully beaded rifle sling, the kind only a brother-in-arms might receive. Another handed him a pair of moccasins, clearly custom-made for a white man's foot, as if someone had prepared them before they ever arrived. Jed took each gift with quiet thanks, unsure how to respond beyond a simple nod. His words felt too small for this moment, and still, no one said a word in English. The girl turned to him then. She stepped close, reached into the folds of her dress, and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside it was a turquoise stone wrapped in twine. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers over it. For the first time since she'd arrived, she spoke aloud, her voice low and melodic. You pulled me from the river, she said softly, her eyes locked on his. You brought me back. And now they come not just for me but for you. Jed swallowed hard. Why me? She looked at him a long moment. Because kindness is rare, and when it's given without cost, it ripples like water. My people felt that ripple. At that moment, Jed felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't known was broken. For years he had lived alone, his only companions, the cattle, the wind, and a past too painful to name. But now here stood an entire people saying, in their own way, you are seen, you are valued, You are not alone." And as the sun rose higher and the valley lit with gold, Jed Cartwright realized he hadn't just saved a drowning girl, he had been pulled from the depths too. By mid-morning, the ranch looked like something out of an old legend. Blankets lay spread across the grass, warriors resting with their horses tethered nearby. Fires had been lit for cooking, and the smell of roasted bison mingled with the sharp scent of sagebrush and pine. The quiet hum of different tribal tongues drifted on the wind. 5 languages, 5 tribes, all gathered, not for war, but to honor a quiet cowboy who never asked for anything. Jed Cartwright moved among them like a man in a dream, unsure where he fit in this gathering. No one treated him like an outsider, but he wasn't quite one of them either. He was still the man who lived alone, but now eyes watched him with recognition, not suspicion. He sat on a log near his cabin, trying to make sense of it all. The girl, who still hadn't told him her name, now wore fresh ceremonial clothes, brought by the elders. A soft buckskin dress, a woven belt, and beadwork along her sleeves that shimmered like dew. She no longer looked like a runaway or a river survivor. She looked like a princess, or maybe something more than that. One of the elders approached him again, the same man who had bowed to Jed at dawn. This time, he carried a clay bowl filled with ash and glowing embers. Without a word, he placed it gently on the ground between them and gestured for Jed to kneel. Jed hesitated, but the elder nodded once, slowly. So he knelt. The man reached into the bowl, took a pinch of ash, and marked a symbol on Jed's forehead. Then, in a voice filled with gravel and reverence, he spoke English for the first time. "You saw her, and did not turn away. You gave life. When death reached for her, that makes you more than a friend. It makes you bound." "Bound?" Jed asked softly. The old man nodded. "Our tribes do not gather for a child, even one of sacred blood. But for you, 5 tribes have ridden. You are now part of something much older than land or blood. You are fire beneath the mountain, quiet, but never forgotten." Jed swallowed, unsure how to reply. No man had ever called him part of anything. Not after what happened during the war. Not after he'd left his old life behind. He looked toward the girl. "Who is she?" "She is daughter of wind and river," the elder said, eyes glowing like coals. "Her mother was taken by white soldiers. Her father was chief of 2 tribes, both lost in the same fire. She escaped by a whisper. She was running for the old lands, where her people are buried. When the river tried to claim her, Jed's jaw tightened. She almost died." "Yes," the elder said. "But she did not, because you pulled her free. And now," the old man placed his hand gently on Jed's shoulder, "now she has chosen to stay." That startled Jed. "Stay." She says she dreamed of a silent man and a broken ranch, of a fire that would return warmth to a cold valley. She says this is the place. You are the one. We do not argue with dreams. Jed looked back toward the girl, who now stood barefoot in the grass. Her eyes locked on his. She gave him a small smile, not playful, but knowing, as if she'd seen something inside him that he hadn't seen himself. The elder stood and took a step back. "Tonight, we will light the sacred fires. And then, we will leave her here, with you." Jed rose slowly to his feet. "I didn't ask for this." The man tilted his head. "No, but the river did." And with that, he turned and walked back toward the other elders, leaving Jed standing alone in the morning light. One hand still over the mark on his forehead. In the distance, drums began to beat. And for the first time in years, Jed Cartwright didn't feel hollow. Nightfall blanketed the valley in a deep, velvet hush, broken only by the steady rhythm of drums and the occasional crackle of firewood. Jed Cartwright sat near the edge of the largest ceremonial fire, its orange glow casting flickering shadows. Across the assembled faces, the warriors, elders, and even the horses seemed wrapped in something bigger than sound, an unspoken reverence, as if they were part of something ancient and sacred. The girl sat across from him, surrounded by women from the 5 tribes. They braided her hair with feathers and red thread, painted symbols on her cheeks with white clay, and whispered chants in low tones that rolled through the night like waves. Despite the fire's heat, Jed felt a chill, not from fear, but he didn't understand the full meaning of the ceremony, but he knew enough. It wasn't just a thank you, it was a bond being forged. A crossing of 2 worlds. Someone handed him a carved wooden bowl. Inside was a thick, steaming brew, bitter on the tongue, smoky in the throat. It wasn't just food, it was part of the ritual. He drank in silence. Then, the drum stopped, and just like that, everyone looked toward the girl. She stood up, slow and graceful, her buckskin dress catching firelight like liquid gold. She turned toward the fire, then slowly walked the circle, not once, but 5 times, stopping each round to lay a small object into the flames, a bundle of reeds, a feather, a pinch of river sand, and finally, the turquoise stone Jed had given back to her earlier that day. On the 5th round, she turned and walked toward Jed. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool dirt. She stood before him, looked into his eyes, and then did something that left every soul breathless. She knelt, the same girl he had pulled from the river, now kneeling before him in front of her people. It wasn't submission. It wasn't shame. It was a symbol of trust, a sacred gift, rarely seen, never demanded. Jed felt the eyes of 100 warriors on him, and yet, it wasn't pressure he felt. It was possibility. "I am not a chief," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I'm not a medicine man. I'm just a cowboy who tried to do the right thing." She lifted her gaze. "You are the man the river chose." Jed swallowed hard. "I don't even know your name." "Ioka," she said softly. "It means she brought happiness." He looked down at her. This girl who had nearly died, who now stood at the crossroads of fate and freedom. He didn't have the right words, but somehow, she understood anyway. From behind him, the elder's voice rang out. "By saving her, he has entered the circle. By receiving our gifts, he has honored it. And now, he must decide. Will he return to the silence of his past, or step into the fire and be reborn?" Silence followed. All eyes turned to Jed. He stood slowly, looked once more into Ioka's eyes, then turned toward the fire. His mind flashed with memories, the blood-soaked fields of war, the cabin walls that heard nothing but wind and regret, the years spent in loneliness. And then her face, drenched and pale in the river, then glowing by firelight. "I'm tired of silence," he said at last, "and maybe the river brought you to me, but I reckon you brought me back to life." A soft murmur passed through the crowd. Then the elder smiled. Ioka stood. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Instead, she took Jed's hand and walked with him toward the fire. Together, they threw cedar branches into the flames, and the fire roared high into the sky. A sign, a promise, a beginning. The drums started again, slower this time, like a heartbeat. The 5 tribes joined hands. Songs rose to the stars. And Jed Cartwright, once just a quiet cowboy with a scarred past, found himself standing in the center of a world he never thought would welcome him. He didn't know what tomorrow held, but tonight, for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The days after the ceremony felt different, like the earth itself had shifted beneath Jed Cartwright's boots. The tribes had begun to move on, returning to their respective territories, leaving behind gifts of food, woven baskets, tools, and even livestock. But the biggest change wasn't material. It was the presence of Ioka. She stayed. Jed wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone, let alone a young woman who spoke little but moved through the world with quiet purpose. At dawn, she'd already be gathering herbs by the creek or grinding corn with a stone mortar near the barn. She fed the horses, mended saddle blankets, and once even stitched shut a deep cut on one of his mules. She didn't ask permission, she simply acted, as though the land had already accepted her, and Jed was just catching up. It startled Jed how easily he'd grown used to her. One morning, while fixing the porch railing, Jed looked up to see her, balancing on a nearby boulder, her arms outstretched like wings. The wind teased her long black hair, and for a fleeting second, she looked like something out of an old story, a spirit or a vision. "You always do that," Jed called. She turned her head slightly, smiling. "I listen from high places." "Listen, to what?" "The land," she said, pointing to the east. "Sometimes it speaks before trouble comes." Jed wiped his brow, squinting at the horizon. "You see something?" She nodded, but didn't speak more. That same afternoon, Jed saddled his horse and rode out along the riverbank. He trusted Ioka's instincts more than most men's logic. The river ran smooth, but the sky looked off to pale near the hills, and the wind was shifting strange. He saw nothing out of place, but something gnawed at him all the same. He returned to the ranch. Ioka met him at the gate with her arms crossed. "They were here," she said. "Men, too. White coats, big boots. They asked about me." Jed stiffened. "What did you say?" "Nothing. I hid, but they said they'd be back." He swore under his breath. "Government scouts or bounty hunters. More than likely, men who'd heard rumors about a native girl rescued near tribal territory and wanted to finish what someone else had started." That night, Jed sat on the edge of his bed, his rifle across his knees. Ioka sat cross-legged, near the hearth, her eyes glowing, like amber coals in the firelight. "You don't have to stay," Jed finally said. "If you run tonight, you'll make it far before they return." She looked at him without blinking. "I didn't come here to run." Jed nodded slowly. He didn't argue, not with her, not anymore. The next day, they fortified the ranch. They moved the livestock into the trees, dug shallow pits for defense, and reinforced the cabin's windows with thick planks. Ioka sharpened knives while Jed cleaned and loaded every firearm he owned. It wasn't much, but it was something. On the second morning, smoke rose from the west. Jed saw it first, a narrow black ribbon coiling up behind the hills like a warning. He didn't wait. He saddled his horse, tied 2 rifles to the saddlebag, and turned to Ioka. "You stay here," he said. "If I don't come back by sunset, take the south trail and ride hard." She looked at him with fire in her eyes. "If you ride, I ride too." He wanted to protest, but he saw the same determination in her that he'd seen when she knelt by the fire. She wasn't a girl anymore. She was a warrior in her own right. "All right," he said, "but stay behind me." They rode out together, 2 shadows cutting across the land, drawn not by fear but by the knowledge that trouble had come. that the peace they'd earned with fire and honor was about to be tested, and somewhere behind them, the valley watched. The wind shifted again. The drums of the past were silent now, but a storm was coming. The sound reached them before the smoke did, distant hoofbeats thundering like 1,000 fists against the ground. Jed and Ioka rode hard, weaving between the cottonwoods and over dry stream beds. By the time they reached the western rise, the horizon was no longer peaceful. 5 riders approached from the south, men in dust-covered uniforms, long coats snapping in the wind, rifles strapped to their saddles. U.S. cavalry scouts. Jed signaled for Ioka to dismount and take cover behind a boulder. He stepped out into the open, hands raised just enough to show peace but not weakness. The lead rider slowed, a scarred man with a mustache and cold eyes. His badge was dull and scratched, but the authority in his voice rang loud. "You Cartwright?" Jed nodded once. "We've heard tell you've been sheltering a fugitive, young Apache girl, drowned, but pulled out. That sound familiar?" "Yes." Jaw clenched. "She's no fugitive, she's a guest." "That ain't how the papers read," the man said, spitting into the dust. "There's a warrant out of Tucson. Says she escaped a government train, killed a guard, and ran into tribal land. We're ordered to bring her in. Dead or alive." Yet's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what some sheet of paper says. That girl nearly drowned in that river. She wasn't running from justice. She was running from slaughter." The scout's hand drifted toward his pistol. "You interfering with federal business, Cowboy." Jed didn't flinch. "I've interfered with worse." For a moment, no one spoke. Even the horses stilled, sensing the tension in the air. Then, behind the boulder, Ioka stood tall, calm, unarmed. She stepped forward. "I didn't kill anyone," she said, her voice steady. "They killed my sister. Shot her like a coyote when we refused to go to the boarding school. I ran because I didn't want to die." The scarred scout narrowed his eyes. "Doesn't matter. Orders are orders." Jed's voice turned hard. "You step onto my land," threatening her. "You won't leave it." The scout smirked. "You and what army?" And that's when the wind shifted. From the ridge behind them, the sound of more hoofbeats rose deeper, heavier. Dozens of riders crested the hill, warriors from the 5 tribes, adorned in paint, feathers, leather armor. The same men and women who'd left gifts at Jed's ranch had not gone far. They had circled back, watching, waiting. The cavalry scouts turned in their saddles, now outnumbered 10 to 1. A Lakota elder rode forward, long hair braided with eagle bone. His voice cut through the tension. "This land has seen enough blood," he said. "Leave now, or be buried beneath it." The scouts hesitated. Their leader cursed under his breath, calculating odds that no longer favored them. Jed stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "You came here looking for a criminal. All you found was a girl who survived." A beat passed. Then, with a grunt, the scout raised his hand and wheeled his horse. "Let's ride." "Not worth it." One by one, the cavalry turned and rode away, their pride trailing behind them like dust in the wind. Silence followed. Long and deep. Then Ioka let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jed placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't run," he said. "Neither did you," she replied. The Lakota elder rode up, nodding once to Jed. "You are now bound to her, Cowboy. That is no small thing." Jed glanced at Ioka, then back at the elder. "I reckon I've known that since the river." The warriors dispersed quietly, some offering nods of respect, others disappearing into the brush without a word. But the message was clear. The girl was no longer Ellendin, neither was Jed. Back at the ranch that night, Ioka sat beside the fire, her head resting on Yet's shoulder. The flames danced, but the danger had passed for now. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cedar and rain. And inside, 2 hearts beat a little steadier. Weeks passed. The ranch returned to its quiet rhythm, but nothing truly went back to the way it had been. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods. The horses still snorted at dusk. And the river still ran cold, but now, there was laughter. In the evenings, the smell of new herbs in the stew pot and footprints that weren't Jed's alone on the path between barn and cabin. Ioka remained. She hadn't asked. Jed hadn't offered, but something unspoken tied her to the land and to him. One morning, as Jed repaired the fence along the southern boundary, he looked up to see her planting something in the soft earth. Tiny corn seeds, tucked into shallow furrows with care and prayer. Her fingers moved with purpose, as if she had done this 100 times, though he knew she hadn't. "You plan on spin?" he asked from a distance. She paused, then looked over her shoulder with a smile. I already have." It wasn't a love story in the usual sense. Jed had never been a man of romance, and Ioka had known more sorrow than courtship. But in the gentle way she handed him warm coffee at dawn, and the way he instinctively moved his tools to give her space near the fire, something deeper had taken root. It was understanding, it was respect, and perhaps, in time, it might grow into love. But the world beyond the valley hadn't forgotten them. One afternoon, a rider came through. Not cavalry, just a traveling preacher on his way to Tucson. He carried no weapons, but had plenty of news, and some of it made Jed's stomach tighten. Government's getting real uneasy about these tribal gatherings," the preacher said, sipping water from Yet's tin cup. "Talk is Washington might send a new detachment out west quietly, of course, to ensure compliance." Jed glanced at Ioka, who was kneeling beside the hearth, pretending not to listen. "Come for her again," the preacher added, "one way or another." When the preacher left, Jed stared long into the fire that night. "We can leave," he said finally. "Head south, or west. I've got friends in California. Places they won't look." But Ioka shook her head slowly. "I don't want to hide anymore. If we keep running, we'll never stop." Jed rubbed his hands together. "Then what do we do?" She smiled softly. "We build." That simple answer stayed with him, and in the days that followed, they did just that. They expanded the garden, repaired the barn, painted the shutters. Word went out through the tribes that the ranch was a safe place, a resting point for the displaced, the hunted, and the forgotten. By midsummer, other families began to appear. A young Cheyenne widow with her son, two Hopi sisters carrying baskets of dried squash, an old Apache warrior missing one eye but full of stories and wisdom. No one asked questions. No one needed to. The ranch became something bigger than Jed had ever imagined. More than a home, it was a haven. Sometimes, Jed would catch Ioka standing at the edge of the river, her feet in the water, her eyes turned west, as if waiting for something. One evening he asked her what she looked for. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head, "just remembering where I almost died, and where I began again." He nodded, understanding in his bones. That night, under a sky full of stars, Jed pulled something from his pocket, a piece of carved river stone. On it, a crude etching of two figures. Side by side, he handed it to her without a word. She took it, fingers trembling slightly. A moment passed, then she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. And there, under the dark sky that had once held only loneliness, they sat two survivors, two builders of a new kind of life, not defined by blood, or tribe, or even law, but by choice, and love, and land.